Hello, Tim Wilmot here, and welcome to my watercolor demonstration. This time I'm going to cover shadows. Shadows don't need to be grey. A common mistake with beginners when you're starting out painting and watercolor is to think that shadows being dark, they're going to be of a greyish color. That's not necessarily true. Shadows are an important part of a painting, particularly in watercolor. They're very important in helping us with values in the picture, the different areas of light and dark. And shadows aren't strictly speaking grey. They are inheriting colors of the material they are. If it's grass or foliage, or if it's buildings, and also from colors of other objects around them. For example, the sky on a shiny surface. So the thing is, when you're planning a painting, look at those shadows, observe them for a long time, see what colors, plan your painting and see what colors you're going to be using, what mixtures of hues and colors and the values you're going to be choosing before committing to doing your painting. And deciding those colors is easier when you're doing outdoor painting or plein air. My reference for this painting is a photograph, and well, a photograph is sometimes not strictly speaking a true representation of what we saw on the day when we took that photograph. But when you're painting indoors, as I am now, this is as best it gets. Now, this video is free to watch. It's not free to produce. However, if you like these videos, please support me via my Patreon site at www.patreon, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, TimWilmot. For a small pledge, a very small pledge, I'll be able to continue to bring you high quality, full length watercolor tutorials with commentary. And in return for that pledge, you can send me your paintings for a critique. I'm often asked to critique people's paintings. Well, follow these videos, try it yourself, and I will then give you some a critique back in return. As I say, for more details, please go to my Patreon site and you'll find the links in the description of this video. So the subject of this shadowy painting is Bergerac, a town in the southwest of France. Well, it could be anywhere. It could be any urban scene, could be any bright day, sunny day, casting shadows across our scene. And this one is particularly good for, in my opinion, particularly good for watercolor, because we do have a lot of different values here, lots of different areas of light and dark. Particularly striking in the middle here is this white car with the sunlight hitting the left-hand side here. So obviously the sun is coming from top left, casting its shadows across from left to right of the scene. We've got a fairly bright building on the right-hand side, bright surface of the road here, and then the darks. Well, again, looking at the values on the left-hand side, we're pretty dark there, but I think the darkest area is this road surface here, and maybe nestling in the corner there. So that's the scene. Let's see how we get on. The paper I'm using for this watercolor is Saunders Waterford. It's cold press and 300 grams in weight. The surface is cold press, so that's the medium texture, not too rough, not too smooth in the middle. And as always, the first step is an initial outline drawing using a soft pencil. So I've got fairly dark marks, just defining the main shapes of the objects in the painting. So I've started with the skyline, going around the tops of the houses, just trying to also, in my mind, I'm picturing the finished painting and I'm trying to place it on my paper. So I'm visually sort of trying to trace around that image in my mind. As I say, I'm just trying to get in the basic shapes here, and then down to street level, these, a couple of cars, which were particularly, as I say, particularly striking here to help us add some values into this picture. And then quickly with the line of a shadow there across the road, these diagonal shadows as well going across those middle buildings. Then just define a few verticals, thinking about perspective here with the shop windows up the right hand side. It's a bit of a tricky one, this one, from a perspective point of view, because the road is rising slightly away from us, and then it levels off, so we've got a little bit of tight perspective on the right hand side, and then it sort of levels off a bit towards the middle in the background. As always, I'm going to, as I usually do, I'm going to add in a few figures in here just to help with the composition and scale, add a bit more interest to the picture as well, placing some figures that will help with values in the picture, maybe a little bit of light hitting their shoulders, their heads against a dark background. And then a bit more of the perspective on the left hand side, street level, the side of the pavement there. As I say, we're just getting in the main objects and not too much detail. We do want to think about detail in a painting, but there's a balance. When you're painting in a loose style, as I am, as I tend to do, then we don't want to have too much detail. We want to try and imply detail in a subtle way with maybe little bits of the paper showing, maybe just odd changes in values in a big area, and then we're just leaving anyone looking at the painting using their imagination to think what that might be, whether it's a street light or another figure, or something catching the light. So just there is this balance to not go overboard with detail. That's why deliberately I'm not drawing in all of the windows in my outline sketch. So the palette I'm using today is my normal palette. Starting from the top of the palette, we've got neutral tint, which I would add to with another color to get some quick darks. We've got burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, which I'm using there, a bit of cobalt blue as well. Often combine those two for the sky. Then ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, a bright red, a light red, cadmium orange, and a lemon yellow down the bottom. So this sky it's a small proportion of the overall composition, so we don't want to spend too much time on it. And I just sort of loosely, with a mop brush, I'm using a Raphael mop brush here, just very loosely drag it across, and we've left a few little highlights where there might be just a glimpse of a few clouds. And then I went in with the cobalt and cerulean blue, again dragging it across over the rooftops down into the buildings. But as you can see here, I'm now getting in the sort of base color of the buildings, and I'm going back up into the sky. I've got a slight slope on this board, but we've got a little bit of bleeding. We're going to end up with a soft edge, which can be quite a pleasing effect with watercolor, trying to achieve different edges. So we're just getting in the base wash here of the buildings. So predominantly I'm using a yellow ochre and mixing colours sometimes on the paper itself rather than on the palette. This will go a good deal lighter than what we're seeing at the moment. So you've got to try and compensate for that, maybe sometimes going in a little bit darker, a little bit bolder than you first think. And whilst, I mean, the theme of this painting is shadows, they're not grey. As I said at the beginning, a common mistake with beginners is that you assume a shadow is dark and grey, so you immediately reach for the black in your palette. You might water it down a little bit, and the danger is that it ends up, the shadow ends up being lifeless and dark and uninteresting and unrealistic. So that's why we need to observe these colours. And in these buildings, even the building walls that are catching the light, they're not just one tone, one colour. They've got different blues and reds in them if you look carefully. Sometimes you've got to look at a scene a really long time before committing to paint to it, and with practice you particularly if you're painting the same area and painting the same objects, you're going to get used to what those differences of colours and hues are going to be. So we're just continuing on down across all over the painting and painting nearly the whole surface except for those areas that are going to be preserved for the paper showing through. Some highlights like the cars, for example, and those figures. And me painting in this sort of random fashion here with the brush, with these brush marks going in at different angles. I'm just adding in different colours, which I'll be going over this area down at the bottom again with the dark shadows, but with watercolour we've got some transparency, so we've got these different layers glowing through each other. They're not going to completely, as in oil painting, they're not going to be obliterating what's below. We've got the essence of the colours from below showing through subsequent washes on top. So I'm trying to mix up a little bit of warm and cool here, so the blue cool road and a little bit warmer on the right hand side where the sun is hitting that side. And then over on the left hand side I've just dropped in a little bit of yellow ochre to if you like, it's sort of reflecting the building above it. So again, that will maybe show just through a little bit when we go over with our dark shadows across the road. But get it in now. Timing is important when we're putting down this first wash. With practice, you know how long you can work a watercolor based on the amount of how fluid your paint is, how much water there is, the humidity of the room where you are, the temperature of the room where you are. You'll just get to know how long you can work a painting and add in those colors. So once we've done that first wash, we need to let it dry totally. And I'm going to fast forward very shortly, skipping over the use of my hairdryer just to speed up the process. We'll get through to the next stage. And the next stage will be going in with the darks. So as most watercolor artists do, they will paint start off with the light areas first, then go to the dark areas. There are some people that may start off with the darks. I've done that sometimes before. I've started off with dark areas and then gone lighter as an experiment. But generally speaking, starting off with the lighter colors, and it's easy with watercolor to apply darker tones on top. So we've just done a little bit of fast forwarding there, and with the same mop brush, now this is what I'm using here is a Raphael mop brush. It's different from the ones I'm normally using at the moment. This one is natural hair. I got it on a sale, a promotion, from a Raphael distributor. I don't think they're manufactured anymore. So it's a natural hair, and brushes, when I hold them, I generally hold them sort of halfway down or right at the top. This time I'm holding it quite close because I want to get a little bit more control with some more precise areas there. So that chimney and the light hitting this roof, going around the roof. So I'm actually going to leave that roof unpainted. It's taking the full force of the sun there. So trying to think about contrast and emphasizing things. So I've just done a few lines and instantly, hopefully, it does look like a roof with the shadow on the right hand side under the eaves. Now this right hand side is going to be quite dark, so we'll go a little bit darker as I go down that wall. So with these shadows, I'm adding in a bit of blue, bit of neutral tint, and then with the side of the brush, just dragging it across. We've just got the right consistency of paint so it just drops smoothly off the brush. And not too thick, so it's sort of showing a little bit of the colours behind the initial wash. So as I'm going down, it doesn't matter if I don't paint over everything. So there I'm alternating my shadow colour, a bit of alizarin crimson, a bit of burnt sienna, a blue again, just alternating them, dropping in some colour into those shadows. But I need to get a little bit more intense as I go down to street level. and maybe a little bit warmer as we come down as well. So this is a fairly classic mix to get those interesting darks as the ultramarine blue, a burnt sienna, and alizarin crimson. And then down to the top of that left-hand car, which they're almost a focal point in the painting. So I want to try and achieve the maximum contrast between the light hitting those cars and the some nice colourful shadows behind them, but a darker value, a much darker value. So now for these middle buildings, excuse the glare of my light there, that will go as it dries. And I'm coming down to the tops of the shop, some sort of blinds or something catching the light there. So again, I'm just leaving that unpainted, and then a lot darker below. So this second car that caught my attention for this painting, go around that and down to this middle figure, right back up to the top, and a bluish shadow, nice cool shadow, holding the brush at a slight angle, and then dragging over to the right, getting a nice hard edge on the top, slightly softer in places on the bottom. Now, for the left-hand side, I think I need to start off quite dark at the top, and then as I come down, there's going to be more light. So the light's coming, the light is bouncing off the right-hand building and then going back into the left-hand building. So it's going to be a little bit lighter perhaps towards the base, so darker at the top and then come a little bit lighter down towards the bottom. And as I'm coming down, we have these shop windows that are like car windscreens. If you look at them, there's lots of different things going on, colours, reflections of different objects around them or above them, and that's true of these shop windows. So I want to try and give the impression of that by just in a random way just painting over this area. It's not an important part of the painting, it's not going to be a focal point, but I just want to give the impression of those shop windows and some of these reflections, objects behind the window, maybe catching the light, and these shadows, adding in those different warms and cools, bit of burnt sienna in the middle, a cooler, cobalt in the middle, and then for the road, now this is going to be darker. The value of the road is darker than the left-hand building wall, so I've got to go a little bit more intense with my colours, and keeping it cool. A lot of blues here. And again, mixing on the paper, not always having to mix on the palette, mix on the paper, as long as it's not too thick. It's still, with the mop brush, it's holding a lot of moisture, it's retaining a lot of water, so I can keep going back to the palette and pick up a little bit of paint and then apply it to the paper straight away. And these shadows going across the road, I'm going to get a bit warmer as we go over to the right hand side. So cool on the left, warm on the right. I'm actually alternating the brush stroke directions here, and that's adding hopefully a bit more interest to these shadows, so we're not getting a bland area. It's not too monotonous. And then up to the base of these figures. So I often do, where I've got figures coming out of shadows, I'll often do the foreground shadows first and then drop the figures in afterwards, just to let the body or the legs drop into the shadows. And then up the right hand side. So there are a bit of shadows hitting this right hand side. This shadow that's come across the road hits the right hand side, then goes vertically up the right hand side, and that gives, maybe from a composition point of view, that's giving a nice frame to that right hand side, sort of matching a balance to the left hand side. So smaller brush, and we'll get in these figures. So starting with the left hand figure, as I say, just dropping in the figure into those shadows, just letting everything blend in with each other, just letting watercolor do what it wants to do. I'm just giving it a bit of encouragement. So with these figures, I generally start off with a face, a couple of arms or hands, and then colour in their bodies. So this one, this middle figure, I'm imagining the light is hitting the left hand side, the person's right hand shoulder, and the stomach. Maybe this person's a little bit overweight, so a little bit of their stomach's catching the light. Let's go for a darker figure on the right hand side, slightly different angle, slightly different poise. So I'm doing this with a smaller mop brush. But again, with these two figures, I've dropped their legs into those shadows. The shadows are still quite moist or damp, so everything's blending in with each other. Now, these vehicles, a lighter colour here. Back windscreen. Let's have this right-hand car slightly different colour. Got a bit of a sort of yellow ochreish theme here, and almost going over to the shoulder of that middle figure. Now shadows for the cars, neutral tint, bit of ultramarine blue, so quite a dark mixture, but so not neat neutral tint. If you haven't got neutral tint, Payne's Grey is another one I've used. And as I'm painting the shadows at the bottom of those cars, the cars are still quite damp, and we've got a tiny little bit of bleeding going on. Just define a few wheels. I tend not to put too much detail into wheels, but I think this needs it here when we're sort of almost sideways onto those cars. We do need to give some impression of a wheel there. And then back windscreen. In fact, we'll do both these cars. Back windscreens. Again, just helping with the values. Difference in values there. Now, the shadow on the road is still damp, so I'm doing a bit of splattering here just to add in a bit more interest to that surface, to that just to add a bit more texture to it. And as it dries, it's going to soften up, give some quite interesting little shapes. Now the sort of final stages of this painting is to now get in some details, but not too many details. I still want to try and retain that loose feel to it. So I'm using a small synthetic round brush here with a fairly good edge, fairly good point, and a thicker mix of colour here. So smaller brush, thicker paint consistency, and just defining some architectural details in a simplistic way. Not painting all the windows, and picking up on some of the areas that I've left highlighted. Not too many details on the dark side of this building, but I'll need to get in a few street level doors on the front, and I'll use my finger just to smudge things along, just to help it. So let's just define a few doors, a couple of doors on that building. Now as we come towards us, I do need to, of course, add in some details to these middle buildings. The edge of the roof, windows, the first floor, just where I left it highlighted a bit. So at this stage the brush doesn't really have a lot of moisture in it. They're almost dry brush strokes, and it's sort of pure pigment, just slightly lighter with those first floor windows and under the shop blinds. Maybe a few doorways that would just add a bit more contrast to the light roof of that car. And we could do that with the figures as well, getting some sort of dark shape in behind. Well, I'll get in a darker doorway behind that middle figure just to define that head a bit more. So there's a big shop window there. Yeah, so get something in behind that middle figure just to add a bit more definition to this person's head. Hopefully that makes a bit of a difference there. So light, something light with something dark behind it, or it could have gone the other way. It could have been something light behind and then a darker figure on top of that. Bit of trim to these cars, just a few horizontals, the back. Now over to the left hand side. Like the building at the back, the shady wall, I don't want to add too many details in here, just define a few lines of the windows and the maybe the shop sign that's going across the top of the ground floor windows, just to help with the perspective a bit, and then a few lines just helping with the perspective of the pavement. And likewise on the right hand side, a few verticals for the windows, not too many, because this is over on the right hand side. We don't want to overdo this or add in too much detail. So I'm just really contemplating, thinking when I'm going to finish this painting now, thinking about when is the ideal time to stop. So I'm just basically traversing around the painting, just adding in smaller bits of darks, details here, not trying to overdo it. Maybe some street lights, some cable going across the road, just something defining the ridge of the roof there on that background building. Maybe a few more shadows, smaller shadows going across the buildings. Let's just make the top of this figure slightly darker because it's more in the shadows than the middle figure. I think the shop window needed just something in it, just to say it's a shop window. A few diagonals to help with giving the impression of the direction of the sun. Maybe a few objects sticking out from the buildings. And that's it. We're done. So this is the finished painting, taken with a different camera. So there might be just a few differences here in the intensity of the colours, but this is hopefully a truer reflection of the painting. So the theme of this watercolour tutorial is trying to make shadows interesting, not make them too grey. They're going to be inheriting the colours of the materials they are, or the objects around them. So plenty of shadows in this street scene with the background buildings. I tried to mix up my warms and my cools by adding in a lot of cobalt blue into the cooler areas, and then burnt sienna for those warmer areas. And then the classic shadow mix or shady mix is the combination of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, or I sometimes use burnt umber, and alizarin crimson, and then adding in neutral tint if you do want to get really dark. But I preserve the neutral tint just for picking up the details of the windows, some architectural details, the darks underneath the eaves of the roof there, windows, doorways, and figures. For example, this right-hand figure here was quite dark. I've left, well, I could have painted a little bit in with the that lighter area there. I could have painted in the body a bit more, but I've got a nice sort of, hopefully a nice difference of values there: light, dark, light, dark, and so on. These different bands of values going across the picture. A big area of the painting is this left-hand side here, which I've kept deliberately simplified all the window details and the reflections, and the road surface, which was predominantly quite dark in value, and I saw lots of blues in it. Probably if we were there on the day, we might see different colours as the light comes around. It would change totally, and that's, as I say, that's what you've got to do, particularly if you're painting outdoors or plein air. You're wanting to take time to look at the scene before starting to paint. And as you're painting the scene, well, you're deciding what colours they're going to be first of all, but as you're painting the scene, you're constantly looking at the object that you're painting, and not just guessing what this is, or what the shape is, or what the color is. Just constantly observing your reference before committing. Watercolor is a great medium for having these lovely effects of these balloons, and where it's moving around the picture with a slight slope. As we painted in the left hand side here, the colors did move a little bit. For the filming, I don't have my painting at a big angle. It's fairly flat, maybe about 10 degrees off the horizontal. Probably a good bit steeper than that if I'm doing demonstrations to workshops or anything like that. So it's going to travel a lot more with gravity. So hopefully you like that video and have a go yourself. So thanks very much for watching. If you want to see more of my paintings, please go to my website, which is www.timwilmot.com. And as I said at the beginning, if you'd like to have a go yourself and get a critique from me in return for a small pledge to help me to continue to produce these full-length watercolor tutorials, please get more details at my Patreon site, www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. Thank you to all of my active patrons right now. I do appreciate your support, and I look forward to seeing your paintings, of course, in due course. More details on the rewards and the projects got to Patreon. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch up with you on the next video.